Hello and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event on how to protect yourself from ransomware in 2024. As attacks change, your defenses need to keep up. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have that dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that come in. That Q&A panel is also the place to just say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. We love to see where you're logging in from, and it's also the place to let us know if we can help in the unlikely event that you have any technical issues. A browser refresh is going to fix most issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, these Expert Series events are always special product neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field. But the support of our sponsors makes it possible for us to bring you this content. So we want to give a special shout out to our sponsors. So over the next few slides, I'm going to share some messages from our sponsors today, and they'll refer to links that you can find in the handout section of your console at any time during the presentation. As always, the handout section also has a few valuable Actual Tech Media links. Especially like to call out the link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, more events like this one. And now, before we get into the main presentation, a few words from our sponsors. So we are supported by Cisco Umbrella, cut complexity, reduce risk exposure, and improve performance. Help protect against and remediate one of the fastest growing and most dangerous cyber threats to your business. That's ransomware, of course. So there's a link there where you can take the next step for an Umbrella demo, and you can also find that link in your handout section. We are also brought to you by TierPoint. As attacks change, your defenses need to keep up. Right on theme with us today. So TierPoint helps businesses thrive in a changing cyber threat landscape. They offer versatile platform agnostic solutions across IT environments, safeguarding your operations with disaster recovery and end-to-end security services. Their holistic approach includes planning, containment, investigation, negotiation, payment, recovery, and prevention. And consulting services cover assessment, strategy, staff augmentation, security, compliance, and governance. There's a link at the bottom there where you can protect your data against ransomware, that Learn More button, and also, of course, it's available in your handout section. We are also brought to you by Rubrik. Cyber attacks are here to stay. Are you? Keep your data secure, monitored, and accessible everywhere it lives so you can bounce back fast. Craft your cyber recovery blueprint at the link on your screen or in your handout section. We're also brought to you by HPE Aruba Networking. Turn your secure digital transformation into a competitive advantage with HPE Aruba Networking SSE. I hope you've got your phones out. I'll leave this one up for a sec because there's 3 QR codes on here. One is for speaking to an expert, one is for reading the full report, and one is for taking a test drive. The link in your handout section is just for the adoption report. So throughout the event, you can get the link to the adoption report. But if you want to speak to an expert or take that free test drive, you're going to want to grab that QR code. So I'll give that a quick countdown. How long should I leave for everybody to get their phones out and click on a link? I'll give it another 10 seconds. Hopefully that'll do it. So 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. So you don't have to hear me count. I'll take a quick drink. 3, 2, 1. All right. I hope you all got it. If not, just shoot us a link in the questions if there was one of those that you wanted and you didn't grab, and we'll find the link for you. We are also supported by Singularity Endpoint, Sentinel-1. So it's one intelligent platform for superior visibility and enterprise-wide prevention, detection, and response across your attack surface, from endpoints and servers to mobile devices. Again, we've got some QR codes, learning more about Singularity Endpoint and taking a self-guided tour. The link in your handouts is for requesting a Singularity Endpoint demo. So if you want one of those other items, grab those QR codes. Hopefully you've all got your phones out now from the last one. So what it does, deliver unparalleled endpoint protection and detection with broad visibility, rapid response times, and minimal incident dwell time. Reduces mean time to respond with built-in automation and real-time context and correlation. Resolves threats with their patented one-click remediation to reverse and roll back all unauthorized changes. Again, that's Sentinel-1. We are also supported by Commvault. So while a disaster recovery plan is essential to protect your company's infrastructure, you won't be fully protected unless you also have a cyber recovery plan and testing strategy in place too. So Commvault Cloud Clean Room Recovery provides an affordable, clean, secure, isolated recovery environment on demand for testing cyber recovery plans, conducting secure forensic analysis, and uninterrupted business continuity. So in that QR code there, that book, the ebook, is also available in your handouts. So once again, just take advantage of that handout section just throughout the event. So many great resources that we just went through. You can find all those links that you've just seen. And again, if there's one of those in there that you weren't able to get your phone up in time for, just let us know and we'll find the link for you. Okay, well, with that housekeeping and sponsor messages, let's get to today's fantastic content. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Allan Liska. If you've been with us for a while, he's been with us for a while. He's one of the foremost experts in the industry on ransomware. He's written several books about it, and at Recorded Future, he helps keep tabs on all the trends and tendencies among attackers. He's in demand as a consultant. In fact, he's logging in today from Singapore, where he's been talking to clients there about ransomware. So all that makes him the perfect person to lead us through this discussion of how ransomware attacks are evolving in 2024. Allan, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks, Scott. I always love doing this, and I love our conversations. And certainly the questions at the end are really nice. So I appreciate you having me, and thank you all for attending on a Friday afternoon.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to this too. So I'm going to back out of the scene here, and I'll be back on for Q&A. Take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks. So let's start with some numbers. We know that ransomware attacks were on the rise in 2023, but where do we stand in 2024? So if you look at these numbers, you can see that we had an increase in the number of attacks. Oops, there we go. You can see the way publicly reported attacks increased in 2021, 2022, jumped dramatically in 2023, and slowed down a little bit in the first half of 2024. And we'll see whether or not that slowdown continues. But one of the things that you need to understand is that these are just the publicly reported attacks. And the real number of attacks are significantly higher than this. These are the things we're able to gather from ransomware data leak sites and from news reporting and so on. But most ransomware attacks don't get reported. So the numbers likely are significantly higher than these, but it's good to have at least this baseline of numbers so we can understand what the trends look like. And ransomware really is an equal opportunity type of attack. There's ransomware is not targeted in the way that we normally think of attacks being targeted. So in traditional terms, when we talk about a targeted attack, what we're talking about is a nation state tells their people, go after the aerospace industry in this country, and then the nation state actors go and target them. Ransomware groups target vulnerabilities, and we're going to talk a lot more about this going forward. And so that means that they are spread out not just across industries, but geographically. So there is no, oh, I'm too small to be hit by ransomware, or I don't have anything that they want. They want whatever they can get, and that's what we've seen over the last year is whatever industry they can hit, that's what they're going after. Now, if ransomware was a bad movie franchise, think Halloween in the 80s or Police Academy, also in the 80s, basically any movie franchise from the 80s where you started to get into 7 or 8, this year would be effectively, ransomware for law enforcement strikes back. And this really has been a year of law enforcement taking sustained action against not just ransomware, but the groups that support ransomware groups. So we go back to December and we start with the ALV / Black Cat disruption. That was big because they were one of the bigger ransomware groups. And then we saw the arrest of a member of Scattered Spider in January. You'll remember that Scattered Spider were the groups that were behind the attacks on Clorox, Johnson Controls, and probably most well-known, Caesars and MGM in Vegas. So we had the first arrest in January, and then we had the first attempt at the Lockbit takedown. And what was interesting about that, how that differed from attacks in the past, is that was intentionally an ongoing operation. The NCA, the British Crime Agency, very specifically said, hey, this isn't just us taking down the infrastructure. We're also going to continue to go after this guy and anybody that he's worked with. And that's been very effective. And that's led ultimately to them outing him in May. But that sustained operation had the desired effect of making him a pariah in the underground community, where none of the affiliates that used to work with him, none of the people that were part of his ransomware as a service want to continue to work with him. And while occasionally he still lists victims on his extortion site, Lockbit has effectively been neutered as an operation. The Lockbit ransomware group has been, unfortunately, because the code's leaked, there are a lot of little mini groups that are using it, but we've managed to shut him down, and that has had a real impact on numbers. In May, we saw breach form seized for like the 30th time. It's already back up again under a new name. But again, every time those seizures happen, more intel is gathered. The end of May, we saw Operation Endgame, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute because that was a different kind of operation that I think is going to have a broader impact. And then we also saw a second member of Scattered Spider arrested. And this, one of the things that I think people don't quite understand is, while most ransomware operators are really good at the one thing, at carrying out ransomware attacks, moving around your network, stealing data, encrypting files, etc., they tend to be really bad at a lot of the other stuff. And this was a great example. They were able to arrest this guy in Spain because his name was Tyler something or another, and his handle on Telegram was Tyler B. So it was really easy for law enforcement to put those two things together, find him and arrest him. And we're seeing more of this with the global ransomware task force that President Biden had set up, that intel sharing between companies has become incredibly valuable. And it's what's leading to a lot of these operations, including the most recent one last week, where they disrupted a lot of the Cobalt Strike infrastructure. If you've never heard of Cobalt Strike, completely understandable, but Cobalt Strike is a red teaming tool that a lot of the ransomware groups like to use because it's designed to be hidden. And so basically what they did was working with the company behind Cobalt Strike and with Microsoft, they helped to dismantle unlicensed versions of Cobalt Strike, which is what all of the ransomware groups use. They don't pay for a license for it. They just steal it and crack it. And so by shutting those down, then it makes it harder for the ransomware groups to move around your network and stealthily get access to different parts of the network to steal data and so on. So again, it's part of that let's disrupt from all levels. And we love to see that, and we hope to see more of that as the year progresses. So I want to go back to Operation Endgame. And what Operation Endgame was a takedown of the tools that are used by the initial access brokers when they first land on the network. And that's really important, and we're going to go into a lot more detail in a bit on this. But ransomware has really become a division of labor. And you have one set of threat actors who carry out the initial access, get on the machine, and they turn around and they sell that to the actual ransomware operators. So if you can disrupt the ability of people to get that initial access, then it makes it so much more difficult for the ransomware operator to carry out their attacks. Initial access brokers really serve as a force multiplier. They allow the ransomware operators to carry out multiple attacks in a month. If I'm a ransomware operator and I have to get the access and then also carry out the attack, that slows down the number of operations that I can do. And so the question is all this law enforcement activity having an impact? And the answer appears to be yes. If you look at the numbers for March and April of 2024 compared to March and April of 2023, you can see that they are significantly lower than what we saw. These are the numbers of publicly reported attacks. And again, publicly reported attacks aren't all attacks, but it's enough to show the trend lines are trending down. Now, everybody's looking at May right now and going, but wait, May was way up. Here's the problem with relying on criminals to tell you about the number of victims they have is, so what happened in May, Lockbit, trying to stay relevant, posted a bunch of basically fictitious victims on his website. Something like 70% of the victims that he posted in May were either old victims that he reposted or completely made up. So while the May numbers look really bad, it turns out that there were a lot of them that just weren't real, but Lockbit was trying to convince everybody that he was still operating his ransomware as effective as he's always been, and it turns out that's not the case. In fact, when we look at the June numbers, which aren't out publicly yet, but I'll tell you all, we're back down to about 250. So again, significantly less than the numbers for June of 2023. So we really are seeing this have an impact. Is there still lots of ransomware? Yes. Will ransomware recover? Unfortunately, probably. But for right now, we are seeing all of this law enforcement activity have a real impact on the number of ransomware attacks. And that's great because we all tend to be really cynical and think, oh, yeah, law enforcement takedown, they're just going to bounce right back. When you have sustained activity like this, it does appear to actually reduce the number of attacks. That's awesome. So what do these modern attacks look like? Well, again, we talked about the division of labor, and this is how that divides up. You start with initial access. And we tend to we talk about a ransomware attack as a single attack, but really it's at least two different attacks. because the initial access brokers are gaining access. And how are they doing that? We're seeing a lot of phishing. We are seeing a lot of credential stuffing and credential reuse. We just see breach after breach after breach after breach of data being stolen from all of these major companies, and all of those credentials being dumped on underground forums and allowed and then being used by other threat actors to gain initial access. In phishing, we're starting to see AI being used to create custom phishing emails that are more effective, and to create audio and video based emails. So we're seeing a lot more complexity in there, which means you've got to keep your defenses up to be aware of those things. We're seeing third-party breaches where ransomware actors are taking a cue from nation states, where they'll land in a network and they'll land in a network and they'll realize that that network is connected to much more interesting networks. And instead of doing anything to the first network, they'll use that access to jump to the other networks. We're also seeing exploitation. If you own an SSL-based VPN and a vulnerability is announced in the SSL VPN, within 24 hours, we are seeing that exploited widely. So we're not seeing 0 days. We're not seeing the ransomware actors, for the most part. There's a couple of exceptions. We're not seeing them craft 0 days for these SSL VPNs, but they've gotten so good at weaponizing vulnerabilities, they can move very quickly when one's announced. And again, those initial access brokers start scanning immediately, start exploiting, get that access, and turn it over. And so many companies do have SSL VPN because they have work from home opportunities, and so it's completely understandable. We're also seeing more and more social engineering, again, especially when you talk about groups like Scattered Spider that are Western based. So not, the core of them aren't in Russia or Eastern Europe. They're in the US, UK, places like that. They also tend to use a lot more social engineering as their way of initial access. So you'll see sometimes where they call to pretend to be the help desk, or the other way around, they call the help desk pretending to be you, and use that access to get initial access. And then very, very rarely, but not at all, we do occasionally see insider threat. For the most part, employees, even if they hate the company they work for, hate ransomware actors more. So that's why we don't see a lot of it. But we do know that ransomware groups are really interested in it. And we have heard of a couple of cases in overseas help desks where the ransomware actors have been able to convince people working for overseas help desks, overseas outsourced help desks, I should say, to get them access into networks. Again, it does not happen very often, but it doesn't not happen. So it's something to keep in mind. Then once the initial access broker has had access, they turn that over to the ransomware operator, who then carries out the attack. A lot of the things that we're seeing here are the same things that we've seen for a while. So again, Cobalt Strike, Brute Retell, a lot of PowerShell. If you're not logging PowerShell, you really should be logging PowerShell to find the bad guys. We see the same tools being used over and over again, whether it's PowerSploit, AdFind, Mimikatz. Those tools are fairly common and well-known red teaming tools that the ransomware actors like to use. The other thing you see down at the bottom is most ransomware operators do not like to use the command line to jump from machine to machine, so they will download and use these remote management and monitoring tools. So Altera, Screen Connect, etc. That is good for you, because if you have an EDR, if you have some kind of security endpoint system, those tools they don't hide. They're not meant to be stealthy. They're just meant to download and use. So if you have the file hashes for those tools, and they're not things that are supposed to be running in your network, those are real easy things to look for. And if you find a match, start an investigation or create an alert. Beyond that, we're seeing an increase in the number of data theft only attacks. So the number of attacks that don't involve any encryption are about 25% of ransomware attacks right now. That's 2 years ago, the number was about 10%. So it's a pretty big jump, even though overall it's a small number of the total number of attacks. A lot of the ransomware groups are just deciding that dealing with encryption, dealing with providing decryption keys, etc., not worth the effort. But that is something to keep in mind, that data theft is is a business model on its own for some of these ransomware groups. And then this is sort of how this is divided. This is also about the extent of my Photoshop skills, so enjoy this masterpiece. That's the best that I can do. But basically, we're talking about a gig economy. Initial access broker gains the access. They sell it to the affiliates who carry out the attacks, and then whoever operates the ransomware as a service offering, they're the ones who handle the negotiation and maintain the software, etc. And that's a very symbiotic economy, but it's also a specialized economy. But because there is so much ransomware, because there's so much activity going on, we really do see everybody making a good deal of money from carrying out these attacks, unfortunately. So again, this is just what I have been talking about. The initial access brokers really are that force multiplier, and we are talking about an actual underground economy, a complex economy where these different groups work together so that everybody can make money. And then the last little piece that I want to talk about is info stealers. I mentioned already the data leaks that, the sort of the rampant data leaks that we're seeing. They are absolutely not core, but they're where these initial access brokers are, because the initial access, the info stealers will sell the credentials for 10, 15, maybe $50, depending on the network, etc. The initial access brokers will collect hundreds of those, try to get into all of the different networks, and if they get access, they will get and firm that up. They then sell that access from a couple $1,000s to maybe 10, 15, 20,000, depending on the size of the network and where it's located. Then the ransomware operator takes over. Their ransom demands are usually in the 6 or 7 figures. Some are less. Some, we've seen a couple recently that were significantly higher, 8-figure ransoms, unfortunately. And then, your ransomware operator, the one who owns it, they get a 10 to 20% cut of any ransom that's paid. And this is a fast process. According to CrowdStrike, initial access brokers, once they get in using whatever method they are, it takes about 79 minutes until they have admin control. So that means that they have enough ability and enough assurance that they are not going to lose that access, that they can go ahead and turn around and sell it. And it takes them 79 minutes. Less if they land in a network that's enabled local admin access for everybody. Please stop doing that if you can, because then they immediately have access. They then have to sell that access, and a lot of that selling is done on these kind of underground forums. So we see XSS, RAMP, etc. But then some of the more well-known initial access brokers, they have private Telegram and Talks channels, and they'll carry out auctions and sales there. Those are invite only, and they do that because they feel like it's much more secure. According to Sophos, on average, a ransomware operator takes 5 days from when they first land in that network. So there's that period of time where the initial access broker has admin access and it's beaconing out. They have to go and sell that. That can take a while, or it can be immediate. But then once the ransomware operator is on the network, takes them about 5 days. We've seen shorter. We've also seen a little bit longer. But according to Sophos, 5 days on average for the ransomware operator from start to finish of the attack. But there is a caveat there. According to Microsoft, within 24 hours of a ransomware actor landing in your network, they are on your domain controller. Once they are on that domain controller, it is so much harder to get them off your network because they plant all kinds of little tricks and bugs and creating additional admin accounts and stuff like that, ways that they can keep access to the network even if you kick them out. So ideally, you want to stop at the initial access broker level, but if you miss that and you stop at the ransomware level, you want to make sure you're doing it quickly. And I kind of want to end on this note. I'm a big fan of 70s Kung Fu movies. I love Bruce Lee. And right now, because ransomware is so rampant, and in particular, there are so many initial access brokers out there, you almost have to be like, there's that one scene in every Bruce Lee movie where he's got to fight 7 guys at once. And he doesn't have the ability to say, oh, I'm only going to fight these 6 people because if he misses one of them, that's the guy that's going to hit him over the head with a wrench. And that's the way you are as a defender right now. Unfortunately, because ransomware is so profitable and because all of these initial access brokers have all of these different methods of attack, and there are hundreds of them out there, you are under constant assault from people carrying out these phishing attacks, from these initial, from these credential reuse attacks, from the exploitation, anything that is publicly facing. They're happening all at the same time. So the way we usually work in security is we work by quarters, right? Well, our project this quarter is to improve the way we do patching. Next quarter, we're going to worry about identity and access management. And then next year's project is multi-factor authentication or whatever it is. Unfortunately, you as an organization don't have that luxury anymore because if you miss any of these types of initial access, you're going to get hit over the head with a wrench. You're going to get that ransomware attack. And so you've got to figure out ways that you can effectively, and I know you have to do it with less budget and you have to do it oftentimes with fewer staff. How can you defend against these 3, all of these different methods of initial access? And ultimately what it comes down to is the same basics. And, Scott, you and I have talked about this many, many, many times, but it doesn't change. The fundamentals of you need to have good asset management, good identity management, and good data management. If you can do those 3 things well, then once you have those, you can then better secure that. Because if you have good asset management, then you can do better vulnerability management. If you have good identity management, then you can do better protections against credential stuffing attacks. And even with phishing attacks, if somebody's able to get in, you know where they should be talking and not be talking. And if you have good data management and you know where your data is, then you can worry, you know you are being better protected against data theft only attacks. Because the problem with data theft only attacks is it doesn't matter where they get your data from. If your name's on it, you will be listed as a victim. Because the biggest company or the biggest organization that they find is always the one that's listed. We saw this with Clop last year. Clop didn't care who the original victim was. What they cared was the biggest name in the data they pulled. That became the victim listed on the website. So good data management is part of a good data governance program where it's not just knowing how you are securing your data and how you're securing your data in the cloud, but also how are your vendors securing their data and how are their vendors securing your data that they host. And so data governance means knowing where all of your data is and how is it being secured. That is shockingly hard given the number of cloud services that every organization uses right now. Understanding and tracking all of that is another level of complexity that you have to add to your security routine. But again, if you don't, you get the call from the Wall Street Journal saying, hey, why is such ransomware group listing all of your data out on their extortion site? So, so again, thinking about how you can better secure your data as well as your assets and your people. And again, I want to thank you all. I always enjoy these conversations. I hope it was helpful, and we'll certainly, after Scott and I talk, take some questions.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome presentation. First off, I want to say don't sell your Photoshop skills short. I thought that graphic was great.
Thank you.
I also feel like we're getting some insight into the real Allan Liska here, and that is, you love 70s movies, not such a big fan of 80s movies. That seems to be now, one of the things that you mentioned was, some of the AI tools. Is there anything that's emerging in terms of like attacks, what attackers are using? I mean, are they just plugging, social engineering ideas into ChatGPT or something similar and taking what they get, or are there like specific tools that are emerging that are AI based that are being shared among attackers that you're seeing?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things. There are large language models that are specifically built by bad guys to use for bad things, which is kind of fascinating. Most of them are terrible, which is good for right now, but they're always improving, right? Yeah. And not so much with ransomware, but with business email compromise, we are seeing the better deep fakes that are being used in business email compromise attacks, which is a whole other webinar that we could probably have at some point, because you can relatively quickly make a voice recording of your CEO asking for money that sounds pretty realistic. You could make not a great video, but you can also make deep fake videos of the CEO asking for money. Those aren't quite as convincing as the voice, but the voice stuff that's being done with AI is actually pretty strong, and we see a lot of companies falling victim for that. A lot of people in companies falling victims for that because it does sound so realistic.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Now, sort of along the same lines, I guess I've always thought of ransomware, geographically as being sort of, centered in like Eastern Europe and Russia, like a lot of like the most successful actors. And you mentioned that, some of this AI based stuff is coming more out of like Western groups or Western actors. Are we seeing any kind of shift in sort of the geographic mix of attacks overall?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the blueprint's out there for anybody who wants it, right? If you want to know how to carry out a ransomware attack, then the blueprint is there to do it. So we just saw a group operating out of Turkey that was arrested carrying out ransomware attacks. We're seeing more groups out of Brazil, groups out of India, groups out of Indonesia. So we are seeing new groups pop up in other parts of the world. And in particular, the Western-based groups, so that's Lapsus and Scattered Spider, are Western-based. They're part of a larger collective that's known loosely as CALM, and it's basically a place where teenage hackers could hang out and talk and start carrying out attacks and so on. And it's one of these sort of weird things, right? It's kind of like the people who in the 30s really loved the mobsters, loved Al Capone and wanted to be like Al Capone. Mm-hmm. These teens, and they really are teens, and in their early 20s, they look up to the ransomware guys and they want to be like them. And I get it. The ransomware guys drive around in Lamborghinis that they bought with Bitcoin. I'm a well-known researcher, and I drive a Subaru. So nobody wants to be like me when they grow up. I'm not cool and sexy. But but the problem is when you and I were growing up in hacker culture, maybe we robbed the phone company of a few bucks because we could, figure out how to make free phone calls from a payphone.
Mhm.
When these guys are carrying out their attacks, they're disrupting multi-billion dollar companies and causing tens of millions of dollars worth of damage. So what they can do with the tools that are unfortunately readily available is much more significant than anything you and I could do in our sort of misspent youth.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. We had a question here from Jeff, who's wondering what's the percentage of 2023 ransomware attacks that are actually, he says that are government. I'm actually not sure whether Jeff is asking like perpetrated by nation state actors or whether he's asking where governments are the victim. But maybe you could answer both ways. And Jeff, if you want to clarify what you were asking about there, that'd be great too. But like, do you have a sense of the percentage of attacks that are coming from nation state actors?
So nation state, so it depends on which nation state you're talking about. There are really four nation states that we see carrying out ransomware attacks. It's Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. Um, in the case of North Korea, they're the only ones who are carrying out ransomware attacks because they want to make money. So, for example, 2 years ago, the Holy Ghost ransomware cleared about $5 million in ransom payments before they were, effectively shut down by the FBI. Um, the other three countries that are carrying out ransomware attacks are essentially using that as a smokescreen, either for disruptive purposes or for espionage purposes. So we'll see. So, like Russia will deploy what looks like ransomware in Ukraine, but it's actually wipers. Like you can't recover from the attacks. Iran is deploying ransomware again as a cover in Israel and in some other, the energy sector for some European countries. China does this as well, where they deploy it mostly in the Asian region, where they'll deploy ransomware as again, as a cover for either espionage or is meant to be a disruption. So, for example, a few years back, we saw them deploy cold lock against gas stations in Taiwan that completely disrupted the ability of people in Taiwan to get gas for several days.
Hmm.
So it's not a big percentage. So again, because they don't ask for money, it's much harder, and they don't operate leak sites and all those other things. It's much harder to gauge how much it is, but it's a relatively small percentage based on what we know. As far as government entities being hit by ransomware, we've seen a lot of that, and that number keeps growing. So for the longest time, a government entity was completely off limits. Now, some of the ransomware groups really like going after governments. So we just saw, for example, Palau in the Asian Pacific region. It's an island out there, was hit with ransomware, a new ransomware group called Dragon Force, and they were disrupted for weeks. They didn't pay the ransom, but yes, there is a desire to go after governments, especially this really goes back to 2021 and what happened with Costa Rica and the headlines it created and the damage it caused, etc. A lot of other ransomware groups thought, okay, I can get a lot of attention if I can take down a government entity, so I'm definitely going to try and do more of that.
Okay. Yeah, and Jeff, thanks for the clarification. It looks like Jeff was asking about that second aspect of the question. There's a question from Andre who's wondering, shouldn't the recent CDK incident be a wake-up call to be more prepared with your incident response and business continuity? I'm not familiar with that, but do you know?
Yeah, so CDK is a company you've never heard of that apparently powers about 90% of auto dealerships in
Yep.
the United States. And when they got hit, nobody could buy a car that worked in the, that was going through that. So literally for a week, many of these dealerships were not able to sell a car because of this software company that nobody had ever heard of except for them. But
Right.
so let's the problem with that is yes it should, but so should the change healthcare attack of earlier this year that disrupted healthcare providers all around the country, or the Kaseya attack that disrupted retailers around the world, or like we keep having these incidents that impact these third parties. Last year when Clorox got hit and nobody could buy kitty litter for a week because they make so many different types of kitty litter and nobody knew that. Um, Ransomware attacks are having a real impact on the supply chain, and we keep seeing these things that should be lessons, but then people aren't learning the right lessons. And Andre is absolutely right. You have to be prepared. You have to be prepared, not just if you get hit with a ransomware attack, but you have to be prepared for what happens if one of your major supplier gets hit with a ransomware attack. What are your alternatives? You and I have talked many times about the importance of tabletop exercises in preparing for these kind of attacks. And that is one of the things that you should be thinking about when you're doing your tabletop exercises is who are our critical vendors and what happens if they're taken offline for a week? How are we going to respond? How are we going to recover? What if it's a month? And what if it's a month and they're not telling us anything, so we have no way of knowing what's going on, which is what often happens in these cases, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. Great. Uh, and thanks for that question. Another one. Well, actually, this is something I'm wondering. You were talking about the growth of sort of the data theft only model, and I'm just wondering what the economics of that are. Is both for, like, do they ask for a ransom for the stolen data, or do they just steal it and try to do something else with it? And so I saw you nod. So if they're asking for a ransom, is it like the same sort of order of magnitude of a ransom as in a like an encrypted data case? Like what do you see there?
So one of the problems with the data theft only model is the reason that ransomware has been so effective over the last couple of years is the kind of the double extortion, right? You are paying to get your data back if it's encrypted, to get your data unencrypted, and you're paying because you don't want your data leaked, right? So
Yeah.
you have sort of two ways that the bad guys are coming after you. Now with the data theft model, you only have the one, right? You've lost the double extortion there. You're back to single extortion. And the question is, how much do people trust that the data is actually being deleted? The NCA, when they seized the Lockbit servers, said that all the data that Lockbit had swore up and down in the chats and the negotiations that he was going to delete was all still sitting there on the server. And I mean, and they're not the first. We've seen this over and over again, where we know that despite the fact that ransomware actors will promise up and down that they're going to delete the data, they're not. I mean, go figure. You can't trust the bad guys to tell the truth. Who knew?
Right.
Um, and so it's some companies will still pay, right? Some companies will pay because they don't want the data made public. They know going into it that the ransomware actor is not going to delete the data. They don't want it published to the extortion site, and they're willing to pay for that. But a lot of companies, you're absolutely right, will say, you know what, we don't trust you. The data is going to get leaked anyway. We're going to get sued anyway. We're not going to pay the ransom. But you may, if you're a healthcare provider, or something like that, where there's especially sensitive records, you just may not want them made public.
Right. Okay. Um, Yeah, I'm just looking through. I think we've hit most of the questions that came in from the audience. Um, and so I just wanted to, recap. You had some really good tips, just as far as, for the way attacks are evolving. One was, of course, the old chestnut of, privilege of, the principle of least privilege. You mentioned patching SSL VPNs as soon as, a patch is available. Logging PowerShell, using EDR to find like rogue installs of things like Altera or Screen Connect. Any other, just sort of 2024 specific takeaways for people you'd like to remind them
Yeah.
about?
So every ransomware incident that I've been involved in for the last 7 or 8 months is, just to be clear, helping recover. I don't actually cause ransomware. Um, One of the things that the ransomware actors do when they land on a new machine is they kill whatever security tool is running. So in the list of tools that I had there, one of the processes that a lot of them use is something called AU kill, which is really good at killing security tools. That's all it does. Especially with EDRs, when something kills your EDR, that should generate an alert in your SOC. And there is, to the best of my knowledge, there's no legitimate reason for any third party tool to kill your EDR, to shut it down on your desktop. So to me, that's something that should always generate a high and immediate alert, something that should be investigated right away. And so that's another one that is, you don't need anything fancy for that. You just need to tune your alerts so that if something kills your security tool, you're responding to that right away. And those are the kind of things that I like to see where kind of people can do that. Other than that, you know, everything else starts to get more complicated when you're trying to figure out how to secure against it. Knowing what machines should be talking to which machines, which people should be talking to which parts of the network, and so on. That's a lot more complex to manage, but those are the kind of things that you also have to do if you're trying to protect yourself from ransomware.
Okay. All right. Well, Allan, just as always, really appreciate your insights. I know it's very late for you there in Singapore, so really appreciate you burning the midnight oil here for us for this event. Thanks so much, and look forward to talking to you again real soon.
Absolutely. It was always a pleasure to be here, and thank you again to everybody who attended. Really appreciate it. And I will talk to you soon, Scott.
All right. And before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business, and that's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card today is Matt Mara from Indiana. So congratulations to Matt. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank all of our sponsors for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That's going to conclude today's event. Happy Friday, everybody. Have a great weekend.